Okay, fantastic. Why don't we get started? So first of all, welcome. If you're here for a big data initiative in international macro and finance, you're in your right room. I'm Matteo Maggiori. I'm the organizer together with Jesse Schrager of the summer school. And so what we thought we would do is start with introductory remarks from me. I'll keep them very short, and then we'll start the actual content after this one. But it's helpful to give you a sense of not only what you're going to experience over the next 2 days, but also why, how do we design it, and probably what's a helpful way to get to use the material. Let me skip this. Okay, so first, the field. This is probably obvious to many of you are already advanced in your own PhD program, and so you have a deep understanding of what international macro and finance is as a field, but also where the research frontier is in the field right now. But some of you are earlier in the program, and they might be deciding between this great field and other lesser fields. And so I thought I would tell you about this great field first and try to lob you into this area. Basically, we study how households, governments, and firms interact in the global economy. And that's an incredibly important topic all the time, but right now especially so, since we're revising a lot of these interactions through a massive change in the global order. It's an issue that affects the life of millions of people. Very directly, but also very indirectly through global macro. So if you think of some of the biggest economic challenges that are present around the world right now, they're at the core of our field. The emergence of China as a global superpower, both from a macroeconomic perspective and from an economic statecraft perspective. The Eurozone, if you step away from the day-to-day, it's probably one of the biggest economic experiments that has been run. It's consolidating together 19 countries into a monetary union with an imperfect fiscal union. They've gone through episodes of price adjustment. Once the exchange rate is not taking the slack of relative wages between Italy and Germany, how do the wage dynamics happen? How do countries get competitive again? They've gone through a massive sovereign debt crisis. And we discovered that we didn't exactly know who was owning the debt. And a lot of the issues of should the ECB step in have led to data advances. Capital misallocation is a big deal. We predicated that we should have this union in large part because it was going to integrate these countries and make, for example, capital allocation much more efficient or deepen the markets. The extent to which that hasn't happened has been a big source of disappointment. There's currently a number of initiatives at a very high level in Europe trying to deepen the union that way. But if we don't even understand why it hasn't happened, it's going to be difficult to believe that the policies that we're going to put forward are necessarily going to work any differently than from the past failures. If you think of the US, there's a big question of the treasury market. The US is a big provider of safe assets to the rest of the world. How's that going to change? The debt levels are going through the roof. The composition of who owns the debt, it's a big issue, not only because of foreign official investors, like famously the holdings of China of US treasuries, but also, for example, foreign leverage players like hedge funds or mutual funds in Luxembourg and Ireland, or some of the largest holders of American securities. Perhaps on behalf of the Europeans, perhaps not. Much more recently, and I think Steve was here, we'll talk about it, trade wars have become a thing. We thought they weren't, and now they are. We saw a big part in the earlier Trump administration, and now this is coming back to an almost unprecedented scale. And it's a moment also where international trade and international macro are coming back together. Part of that is Steve will teach the trade side. They're working much more on dynamic models that features aggregate uncertainty, and that's bringing their models closer to the traditional international macro model. But a lot of the initiative actually focuses on the opposite process. International macro has been catching up to trade because of the availability of microdata. So microdata for firms and exports has been available much longer than microdata, for example, on international financial positions. And so as our data has become much more detailed and giving us access to inspecting the heterogeneity, the models are also moving in that direction. And a lot of the tools from trade have made their way into the international macro tool set. A topic that is close to my heart these days is geoeconomics. It's the idea that countries like the US or China are using trade and financial relationships that are pre-existing to exert power all over the world. And again, it's an area where data, methods that come from international trade, from international market, from political economy are coming together. And so it's a good time to think about these issues and what we can do sort of much better. Ultimately, and I will sort of remind you of this at the end, this is a moment where I couldn't think of bigger issues that we face that have to do with international market. It's both true within the history of the field. This is a very exciting moment. It's a scary moment, but it's also very exciting for research. It's also true across fields. A lot of the issues that the profession has focused on over the last 10, 15 years have been much more domestic. And I think now there's a big shift to these global issues, and then, of course, makes research very interesting. Now, why this initiative specifically rather than the field? So we started this is the 5th edition, and we started it when our own research had moved into microdata. So the when Jesse was a PhD student at Harvard, I was a young faculty member, and we got to know each other, and we thought that microdata was going to become a thing. And at the time, there was some microdata, but not a lot. And the combination of essentially the financial crisis and the European sovereign debt crisis had really pushed the idea that knowing who owns what around the world was a big deal. And that meant that both the public institutions started collecting a lot of microdata. The private institutions were very interested. And we kind of felt that this data was becoming available. So we made an investment in our own research to go into this direction. But as we learned how to do it, one of the things that became very obvious is that the entry costs are much higher than for many other methods that we routinely teach PhD students. And the entry costs have to do not just with the cost of acquiring the data, but how to go through the data, how to sort of speed up your own research process. Because very often it's unrealistic for a young PhD student to set up the computational power, acquire the data, do the contracts. Once you have it, clean it all up. If it takes our lab, like a large infrastructure and a number of people working on it, a PhD student on a laptop is a bit of a daunting task. And so the initiative was set up to try to lower that entry cost by at least making you aware of what data exists, where is it, what are the known issues. And so you will see that the entire course is set up with a double objective. One part is the much more typical high-level intellectual content. Why are these questions important? Why are they interesting? What are people doing? But a second part that I think normally goes underappreciated, particularly in PhD coursework, it's much more the nitty-gritty of, but where's the data? What are the issues? And we really think of it as the question that I normally ask somebody when I get into a data set is, what did you wish you had known 5 years ago when you started with that data? And so a lot of this is from us and other faculty is a download to you of this information. And you don't have to absorb all of it at once. But part of the reason why we record the videos is to make this available to you. A year from now, you might be using data that you never thought you were going to use. And all you have to remember is that these things exist and that the cleaning codes are somewhere to save you 6 months of work. And so that's the other part of the initiative. I think it's has worked out tremendously well, I would say, at least for us. The students tell us that it's interesting. You keep coming, so we take as a review preference that is at least not terrible. Although the fact that it's at Stanford in person and with good food probably has a big component to do with that. But we could test it by moving it online and see what happens. But speaking of the fact that it's at Stanford in person and with good food, that reminds me that I have to thank the people that pay the bill, which are the Stanford GSB and the Sloan Foundation that have made this possible. So we're certainly very thankful to them. OK, so let me give you a sense of what exists and what we're going to do. So first, to you all, but also to all the people that are watching us online, what is available right now, if you go to the website, is all of the history of the initiative. There are codes, videos, data sets that are available to you. You just have to go and download them. And part of what we do every year is we update. So whatever we're teaching this year might be available online in September once we finish a little bit of editing. The other thing that really happens is that we rotate the topics. So there is a core of the initiative that we teach every year that is the basics of data in international, macro, and finance. But then every year, we're lucky to convince a few of our colleagues to come in and teach a particular topic. And part of the reason we're doing that is first, is for those of us that teach it every year to sit where you're sitting and watch our colleagues teach us something, which we're very grateful for. But the other one is to put it online so that the library of what's available keeps expanding. So if there's a topic that we don't cover this year, but we covered in previous years, you can go and look it up. And similarly, every year the students suggest improvements, like things to cut, things that they would like to see. And we've taken on board a lot of those suggestions. If you look at how this has evolved over the last 5 years, almost all of it was from the bottom up, was the students telling us what they thought was going to be helpful to them. So please, when we give you the evaluations, do take them rather seriously because they have an impact on what we do next year. Now, for this year, the part that is available to you only if you're here in person is to meet the faculty. So you will see that the initiative is intense. It's 2 days. It's a lot of hours of teaching, but it also has an incredible number of breaks, lunch, dinner. And that's for you to connect to the other students that are interested in what you're doing, but also to the faculty. So the 3 people on the first row are the people that teach the 2 people, and me and Antonio teach it every year. Jesse Schrager, who's the co-founder of the initiative, unfortunately this year couldn't be here, so he's going to have to skip, but normally he's been here every year. And then this year we have 3 guests. One is Steve Redding, who's sitting at the very bottom of the room. Steve is one of the leading trade economists in the world. We're also very lucky that as of now is our colleague at Stanford. He used to be at Princeton for many years. And he's somebody that has an incredible, his work spans many, many fields and areas, but particularly what he's going to focus on today is sort of data and methods in trade that are bridging the gap between questions that are at the border of macro and trade, international macro and international trade, and it's a very, very active field. Then Melissa Dell will come tomorrow. Every year we have a methodological lecture. So last year, I think we had Susan Ate give AI, we had Nick Bloom give a natural language process, we had David Bakay teach input-output methodologies in macro theory. What they really are is we pick methods that, first of all, we would like to learn ourselves, so they're very self-serving, but also where we feel that many schools do not necessarily offer a class in these methods, and where it makes much more sense for you to be here and listen to that class since it might not be offered in your home institution. And this year, I think we're super lucky to have Melissa because she's been working very heavily on artificial intelligence and large language models, and she's going to present her entire work in the area, and it's, of course, an area that is incredibly active. It's an area where econ faculty doesn't have a deep bench. So in most universities, you would have to go to CS to take classes or to other areas. But Melissa is one of the leading economists that is thinking hard about the methodological aspects. And so she's going to cover that. And then Christopher Clayton, who is also my co-author, is here this year. Him and I will split the geoeconomic sections. So he will think, he's an econ theorist. He will sort of set up the lecture by thinking about why do we measure what we measure in that lecture. So it's going to keep it much lighter than a full theory session, but it's going to, again, remind you that the power of microdata is really only driven by asking good questions. And if you don't know the theory, it's very difficult to figure out what to measure. Generating some stats out of a large data set is a piece of cake. Figuring out which sum stats are a home run and which ones are just one of the many sum stats that you could produce takes a brain. And so he's going to think about that process. So now let's get a little bit more into detail, and then I'll stop. First, when I finally shut up and we start content, Antonio will pick it up, and he will think about aggregate macro data, in particularly public data. One of the things that I always teach my PhD students is there is a sense now that only proprietary data is going to get you a job. And that's actually a false sense. A lot of good papers have been written in the last 4 or 5 years with publicly available data. And publicly available macro data is your friend as a PhD student. It's cheap, no entry cost, It's stable. Somebody updates it for you. It's wonderful. If I could choose to write a paper with any data, I would choose that data. Of course, because of that, it does get eroded quickly compared to other data sets where the entry cost is much higher. But that's a relative statement. And I think in general, we've witnessed students not being willing enough to explore what's easily available and try and test to, in turn to twist and turn into very difficult data sets that might have 6 or 7 months lags to even arrive on your laptop, while you could have probably written a good paper in the meantime. So Antonio's going to cover that. Then we're going to switch to, in some sense, what has built our own research agenda into this. So Antonio and I will split before lunch and after lunch a session on microdata. In this case, is largely commercial data, so you have to pay for it. And we're going to think about why has that been good for research. And the quick answer is it has really allowed us to take basic questions of the field and either provide new facts that weren't there before, or take very old facts like home bias and figure out that once you look under the hood with more data, they're of a slightly different nature in important ways from the way we thought they were. And so it's been a very simple research agenda, but it's been very interesting to us because it has changed our mind a lot in terms of what we thought we knew or what we thought was going on. And so we're going to cover that. Then we'll break, and then Steve will come in, and he will teach a series of 3 papers that are actually very new, and I think they're super interesting. So the 2 papers at the bottom are papers that are trying to really bridge the gap between international macro and international trade. And they're sort of theory meets data kind of papers. And so they should be very interesting to you, both from a methodological perspective and from seeing how the data is being used. And why would somebody that is interested in those questions look at versions of the microdata? Then he's going to teach a top paper that is one of the early papers on the geoeconomics literature, thinking about what is a well-defined sense in which 2 countries might be friendly from an economic perspective or unfriendly, beyond just simply saying, do they like each other? But how do we go about it with measurement? And so that's going to be the trade part for this year. And then tomorrow, we will start with a new session that actually my co-author Jesse should have taught, because he's been leading that production. But since he's not here, I'm going to have the honor to do it. That I'm very excited about. Because one of the things that over the years we've always felt a little bad about is that we teach all this material, and then a lot of the microdata is not so easy to access. Fortunately, the barriers have gone enormously down. A lot of the microdata that 10 years ago when we started our projects was like an heroic effort to even get it out of the provider. Now it's totally commoditized. You approach the provider, you get the contact, you send a check, you have the data. Now there's commercial data involved, so there's a little bit of money, which is still a barrier for PhD students, but it's just an order of magnitude different from where we were 10 years ago. But the reason why I'm excited about this is the word public. For the first time, microdata is becoming available free of charge. And so the public data that I'm referring to is data that the US government is collecting through NPORT, which is a requirement of mutual funds disclosing their positions, which means that you can have microdata available for free on your laptop, just like the session that Antonio is going to teach now on the public data. And that's very, very recent. And so one of the efforts that Jesse has been leading together with Bruno Canavani, who's a PhD student at Columbia, has been taking that data, cleaning it, benchmarking against everything that we already know from other sources, and we're going to put online all of the cleaning codes so that, again, you don't have to go through the pain of downloading it and figuring out how it works. It's public data, and you can have it all cleaned and understood for you and explained to you. So I'm going to teach that part. Then Melissa will come in. She will teach about how to think about deep learning. And in particular, she will teach a new paper of hers came out very recently, thinking about how do we use standard methodologies or standard issues of economics, things like measurement error, bias, what if the data is noisy, to use outputs out of deep learning models, okay, like, for example, classification exercises. She will do that across lunch, and then we will conclude with a session that will do two things. First, it will, from a topic perspective, think about geoeconomics, which, as I mentioned, is a very active area of research right now, thinking about how countries exert power from an economic perspective, so like economic statecraft. It's a topic that economists have largely ignored. It's been very active in political science compared to economics, but where economics methodologies, both from a theory perspective and from an empirical perspective, have a lot to add. And so the profession is very active in that direction. But it's connected to Melissa's session because one of the papers that we've been working on, it's using artificial intelligence on a fairly large scale to do a classification exercise. And so rather than spending a lot of time on the theory, Chris will do just enough theory to understand what it is that we're trying to measure. And then I will take over again and go through how we're using artificial intelligence, in particular large language models, to address those questions. So it will connect well with what Melissa has probably would have taught by then. And then Antonio will wrap it up, thinking about work that him and Chris are doing separately that will instead pick all of the previous day where we did micro data on positions, and thinking, if you're an economist or you're a central bank and you have A, all of this micro data on who owns what around the country, and B, a large shift in technology, namely artificial intelligence and graph neural networks on allowing you to extract much more information out of this data, how would you do it? Which is a brilliant question, because clearly every sitting official in central banks is thinking about it, and economists are thinking about it. And so they'll give you what they've been doing and showing you yet a different application that takes all of the data that we did the first day and in the morning of that day, but rather than doing an approach that is very familiar to economists, either an identification strategy or some very simple summary statistics that are interesting from a theory perspective, we'll instead take a very sort of machine learning heavy approach to it and trying to figure out what other information could we extract out of that data. And then we'll wrap it up. So that's the plan. Now, I'll do this briefly, but if I haven't convinced you already that this is the best field on earth, let me give you another chance. I always loved this field, but when I went to grad school, it wasn't a great time for the field. There weren't that many jobs, the questions felt a little stale, and fields go sort of up and down. But what I always tell my own PhD students is you have to remember the capital stock versus the marginal product of capital. Students tend to be attracted to areas where the capital stock is high. There's been a lot of success, the capital stock has been built, and you can see it. So that gives you a lot of comfort. But you should be thinking that you're next. What matters for you is the marginal product of capital. And generally, a very high capital stock isn't necessarily a good signal for the marginal product of capital. This is an area where I feel like the questions are just as important as I could imagine. And again, I wouldn't have said this 10 years ago, but a lot of the crucial questions were much more domestic. But clearly, we're rethinking the world order, and the stuff happening across border, it's going to shape the world we live in for the next 10 years. At the same time, the data has been accumulating, and we just had a massive shift that was, who knows where it's going to end up on the ability to analyze this data. So the combination of these three things, at least in my mind, makes me as excited about this research agenda as I've ever been. I'm generally an excitable person, particularly when it comes to my own research, but this one feels very meaningfully different from what I've experienced in the last 10 years. So we've been working like lunatics just because it just feels the marginal product is so high. And that doesn't happen all the time. Through your own research, you'll learn that you'll go through periods where it's just fine. It's a little bit of routine, and you're kind of looking for the next thing. But when the next thing comes around, that's when you get really excited. And this one feels exactly like that. So hopefully, you will see something in this initiative or in your own classes that will motivate you to do great work, and you will join us.